"Rancher, please help me. They stole my clothes," said the Apache woman bathing in the lake. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sun was sinking low over the mesas of New Mexico, painting the land in red and gold. Elias Turner eased his horse down the slope toward the north pasture, the leather saddle creaking with every shift of his weight. It had been another long day, mending wire, riding fence, watching the sky for signs of rain that never came. His shirt clung damp to his back, his shoulders ached from the work, but the rhythm of labor was the only thing that kept his mind steady. At 38, Elias had seen more of war and wilderness than he cared to remember. He had scouted for the army in his younger years, riding ahead into Apache country when the borderlands burned with conflict. Too often he had seen men fall, not always in battle, but in the quiet cruelties no one wrote down. And after all of that, death had come for his wife, not with bullets, but with fever one spring. 3 years had passed since, and in their wake he had chosen the solitude of the ranch. The land did not comfort him, but it asked for nothing more than his hands, and that was enough. He was thinking about a stretch of fence gone slack near the north line when movement by the creek caught his eye. The water ran slow this late in the season, breaking into shallow pools under the cottonwoods. At first he thought it was a deer, but the shape was wrong. He pulled the reins and swung down, tying the horse to a low branch. His boots pressed dry grass as he moved closer, careful, silent. That was when he saw her. A young woman stood knee-deep in the water, her long, dark hair plastered to her back, her shoulders tight as though she were cornered. What remained of her dress clung to her frame, torn nearly to shreds. Bare feet raw from running, arms marked with bruises, some old, some fresh. She froze when she noticed him, one arm clutched across her chest, the other gesturing toward the bank where scraps of fabric lay scattered in the mud. Her voice cracked, hoarse from thirst and fear. "They took my clothes," she said. "Please, help me." Elias stood still, weighing the danger. Whoever had done this might be nearby. Bringing her back could mean trouble. But her face told the truth plainly enough. Desperation edged with shame. A plea no decent man could ignore. Slowly, Elias shrugged out of his coat. He held it toward her, keeping his movements steady, careful not to frighten her further. For a moment she only stared at him, eyes wide and searching. Then, with a quick, almost defiant motion, she snatched the coat and turned her back to him, shoulders hunched as she pulled it tight around her body. Elias waited, the sound of the creek running shallow between them. Finally, he said quietly, "All right." He stepped forward, offering his hand, not as command, but as help. Elias reached for her arm once she had drawn the coat tight around her shoulders. Her skin was cold despite the late summer heat, trembling beneath his hand. She resisted for a heartbeat, then let him guide her up the bank. Every step seemed to pain her. Her bare feet left faint smears of blood in the dust. When they reached the horse, she faltered. Elias lifted her without a word, settling her onto the saddle. She clung to the horn, unsteady, and when he mounted in front, she caught hold of the back of his shirt, as though afraid to slip away. They rode in silence, the trail long and rough, the twilight deepening into shadow. He felt her shaking against his back. It reminded him of soldiers he had seen once, half dead with hunger and fear, rescued too late. But this woman was alive, and so long as she breathed, he would see her through the night. The cabin came into view at last, a squat frame of timber, plain and narrow, perched against the line of cottonwoods. Elias swung down first, steadying her as she slid from the saddle. She nearly fell, catching herself only by clutching his arm. He led her inside. The air within smelled of wood smoke and dry earth. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot, and a stove. That was all. The walls were bare, save for a single shelf where a worn Bible rested, its leather cracked with age. Elias lit a lantern, the flame casting soft yellow light against the rough boards. "You can sit," he said, spreading a folded blanket near the hearth. She obeyed, sinking to the floor, the coat still wrapped tight. Her eyes darted to the corners of the room, her breath shallow, as if she expected someone to break in at any moment. Elias said nothing. He set wood to the stove and coaxed a flame to life. The crackle of fire slowly filled the silence. From a small tin box he took needle and thread. The dress she wore was torn near to rags, but his hands were steady as he stitched, rough though the lines were. She watched him the entire time, her gaze fixed as if measuring each move. Elias did not meet her eyes until he set the mended garment aside. By then the fire had warmed the room, and the trembling in her limbs had eased. He leaned back against the wall, the rifle propped nearby, and finally spoke again. "You'll be safe here tonight." The words were plain, but they hung in the air like a vow. He did not sleep when the fire burned low. Instead, he sat at the table with the rifle across his knees, listening for every sound beyond the walls. Behind him, the young woman lay wrapped in his coat and blanket near the hearth. Her breathing was uneven, quickened now and then by dreams or memories she did not voice. Elias kept his eyes on the door. He had guarded many souls in darker years. Scouts, deserters, soldiers too broken to fight another day. But tonight felt different. Tonight he was guarding more than a life. He was guarding a fragment of trust, fragile and uncertain, that had stepped into his cabin out of the wild. And he knew, as dawn pressed faint against the shutters, that nothing about his life would remain untouched. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The cabin was no more than 4 walls of rough-hewn timber, but to Elias it had always been enough. Tonight, with a stranger huddled near the hearth, the place felt smaller, the shadows crowding in close. He set a fresh log on the fire, coaxing sparks into steady flame, then turned back to the woman wrapped in this coat. Her eyes flicked toward him, wary, as though every move might be a trick. She hadn't spoken since the creek, not her name, not where she had come from. Only that one broken plea for help. Elias didn't press. He had learned in war that silence often held more truth than words. Instead, he dug into the small chest by the table and drew out a needle, a spool of coarse thread, and the ruined remains of her dress. The fabric was nearly shredded, torn down the seams, the bodice ripped as if by cruel hands. He said nothing, only threaded the needle and began stitching. His hands were rough, calloused from years of reins and rope, but steady. The firelight caught on the silver glint of the needle as he worked. The lines he made were crooked, uneven, yet each pass of thread was careful, deliberate, an unspoken promise to restore what could be mended. Across from him, she watched. Her dark eyes never wavered from his hands, as if she were testing every motion for deceit. Elias kept his gaze on the cloth. Trust couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned, slowly, in the quiet hours when a man thought no one was watching. When he set the garment aside, patched but whole, he finally looked up. She hadn't moved. Knees drawn close, hair falling loose around her face, she seemed caught between flight and collapse. He reached for the kettle, poured hot water into a tin cup, and set it on the floor near her without a word. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, then steadied as the steam rose against her face. Elias leaned back against the wall, the rifle across his knees. "You'll be safe here tonight," he said quietly. His voice was low, even, meant more as reassurance than command. She did not answer, but she drew the coat tighter, as if wrapping herself not only against the cold, but against memory itself. The hours stretched long. Outside, coyotes yipped across the mesa, their cries thin under the wide sky. Inside, the fire burned low and the lantern hissed softly, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Elias sat awake at the table, every creak of the timbers sharpening his attention. The habit of a scout never left a man. Sleep was a luxury earned only when dawn had broken. Behind him, the woman's breathing came uneven, quickening now and then as though dreams chased her. He didn't turn, but he heard each shift of her blanket, each small gasp. Once, when the wind rattled the shutters, she whimpered and pulled the coat over her head like a child. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, not at her sound, but at the reminder of what or who might still be hunting her. When the first pale light edged the cracks in the shutters, Elias stirred the coals back to flame. He glanced at her then, just once. She was still curled near the hearth, asleep at last, though not peacefully. He exhaled, long and slow, and whispered a thought that was less prayer than instinct, yet drawn from the same well of faith he had carried all his life. Even in the wilderness, Lord, keep watch. Whatever had brought her to his door, Elias knew it wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. The sun had risen high enough to slant through the cracks in the shutters, painting thin bars of light across the cabin floor. Ahyoka sat near the hearth. Elias's coat still gathered close around her, though the fire now burned steady. Her hands were wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, untouched, as if the warmth alone was enough. Elias worked at the table, whittling a strip of wood more out of habit than need. The sound of the knife against grain filled the silence. He had waited long enough, he thought. The time had come for words. "You got a name?" His voice was quiet, almost cautious. For a moment she didn't answer. Then, softly, "Ahyoka." He nodded once. "Elias Turner." No more than that. Introductions on the frontier rarely needed more. She lowered her gaze to the dark surface of the coffee, her fingers tightening on the cup. When she spoke again, her voice was rough, each word pulled from a place raw with memory. 3 men, white, near the town yesterday. Elias set the knife down, his hand still. "They stopped me on the road," she continued, the words short, clipped. "They laughed, took my things, cornmeal I carried, my dress." Her voice faltered, a tremor breaking through. She drew the coat tighter, as though the memory itself could strip her bare again. Elias said nothing. He had seen that kind of cruelty before. Men with whiskey in their blood and malice in their hearts, who treated another suffering as sport. He thought of nights on patrol years ago, when villages had burned under the orders of men in uniform. He remembered the smoke rising over Apache camps, the sound of children crying in the distance. He had told himself then that he was only a scout, only eyes and ears. But the memory tasted bitter now. Ahyoka's voice steadied, though it had grown flat, almost too calm. "I came north. Nothing left south. Army came, burned homes. My people scattered, some taken to the reservation, others dead." Her words settled heavy in the room. Elias stared at the piece of wood in his hand, though he no longer shaped it. He had known such things happened. He had ridden through the ashes himself. But hearing it in her voice, plain and stripped of ornament, carved the truth deeper than any memory could. "Family?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "Gone." The single word hung between them, sharp as a blade. Elias felt it cut, not only for her loss, but for his own, for the wife he had buried, for the silence that had filled his cabin ever since. Different griefs, perhaps, but grief all the same. He pushed the cup closer across the table. "You'll eat here, rest here, till you decide where to go." Her eyes flicked up at him then, sharp, suspicious. "Why?" Elias met her gaze without flinching. "Because I don't leave folks starving at my door." For the first time since he had found her, something in her face shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest easing of the tightness around her mouth. She looked back to the fire, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I will stay, for now." Elias leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. Outside, a hawk circled high against the sun. Inside, the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people holding a fragile, unspoken accord. The next day dawned clear, the sky washed pale and sharp over the mesa. Elias rose early as always, stirring the fire and saddling the horse for work. When he stepped back inside, he found Ahyoka already awake, crouched near the hearth with the coat drawn close, watching him with guarded eyes. "You can rest," he told her, reaching for his hat. Her chin lifted. "I work." Elias studied her for a long moment. The cuts on her feet had not healed, and she moved stiffly, but the set of her shoulders left no room for argument. He only nodded, then handed her a pair of worn socks he had found in an old trunk. She pulled them on without complaint, then stood by the door, waiting. They spent the morning hauling water from the creek to the trough. Elias carried 2 buckets at a time, but Ahyoka insisted on carrying her share, 1 bucket swinging from her thin arms. Each trip left her shoulders trembling, yet she refused to stop. Elias said nothing. He recognized the look in her eyes, the need to prove, to herself as much to him, that she was not helpless. By midday, the trough brimmed full. Elias led the horse down to drink, while Ahyoka stood apart, tense at every sudden movement of the animal. "You ever worked around stock?" Elias asked. She shook her head. "Goats, chickens." "You'll get used to him." His voice was calm, steady. "He won't hurt you." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased just slightly when the horse lowered its head to the water without incident. That afternoon, Elias mended fence along the north line. Ahyoka followed, watching closely, then began to carry tools for him without being asked. She didn't speak much, but her presence at his side felt less like shadow and more like choice. By the time they turned back toward the cabin, sweat streaked her face and dust clung to her dress, but there was a lightness in her step that had not been there before. When they reached the porch, Elias handed her a scrap of cloth and a needle. "You know how to sew?" She nodded once. He left her there while he stacked wood. By the time the sun slid low, she had patched the scrap neatly, her stitches fine and even. She threaded the needle again without being told, her fingers moving with quiet assurance. Elias found himself watching her longer than he intended, the sight stirring something in him he could not name. That evening, as the fire snapped low, Elias sat at the table sharpening his knife while Ahyoka hummed softly near the hearth. The tune was strange to his ear, low, lilting, with the cadence of an old song carried from mother to child. He didn't understand the words, but the sound itself filled the cabin in a way silence never had. For the first time in years, the place felt less like a shelter for one and more like a home waiting for two. The days passed with uneasy quiet. Elias worked the line fences, checked the stock, kept the rifle within reach. Ahyoka carried water, tended the fire, mended whatever he set before her. Their routine held steady, almost normal, yet a tension hung in the air like storm clouds refusing to break. It came first as whispers. Elias had ridden into town for salt and flour. While tying his horse outside the general store, he caught fragments of talk drifting from the saloon porch. 2 ranch hands laughed low, one muttering about Turner's new company up at the cabin. The words were sly, taunting. Elias didn't show it, but a chill ran down his spine. Word had spread. By the time he returned home, the truth had sharpened. Ahyoka met him on the porch, eyes narrowed, a question on her lips before he even spoke. "Them?" she asked. Elias set the sack of flour down slowly. "Might be. Clayton Reeves and his kind." Her face tightened. Clayton. Elias remembered the name then. A rancher's son, restless, mean when drunk. Trouble looking for somewhere to land. He had seen the boy in town before, swaggering in his father's shadow, a grin that never reached his eyes. Now the grin had turned cruel. "They know," Ahyoka said, her voice flat. "They will come." Elias met her gaze, steady, though his jaw clenched. Let 'em try. They'll find me waiting. That night, the unease followed them into the cabin. Elias lit the lantern but left it low, the shadows heavy along the walls. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, each click of the mechanism crisp in the stillness. Ahyoka sat by the hearth, sewing, though her hands trembled just enough to show. Outside, the coyotes called again, closer than before. Elias glanced at the shuttered window, every sense stretched thin. The memory of those men's laughter in town echoed sharp. He bowed his head for a moment, not aloud but within, recalling words that had steadied him in darker times. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Psalm 23:4. The verse settled him like an anchor. Fear had its place, but it would not rule him. When he looked back, Ahyoka was watching. Not the rifle in his hands, not the shadows at the window, but his face. For a moment their eyes held, and something unspoken passed between them. The knowledge that whatever danger crept closer, they would face it together. Elias set the rifle aside and stirred the fire to life. Sparks leapt, bright against the dark. "You're safe here," he said simply. Ahyoka pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. She didn't answer, but this time she didn't look away. The morning air carried the smell of dust and wood smoke when Elias rode into town. Ahyoka had stayed behind, though not without hesitation. She had gripped the doorframe as he saddled his horse, her eyes following him with unspoken worry. He had promised to return before sundown. The town stirred slow under the heat. Wagons rolled hay bales down Main Street, shopkeepers swept their porches, and the blacksmith's hammer rang sharp in the distance. Elias tied his horse near the feedlot, his hat pulled low, and walked the boardwalk with measured steps. The saloon was already loud, its doors swinging open to the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Inside, smoke curled toward the rafters, and the sharp tang of whiskey stung the air. Elias stepped in and ordered coffee from the barkeep, then sat near the back where he could see the door. Old habits kept his shoulders loose, his hand never far from the weight of his Colt. It didn't take long. Clayton Reeves pushed through the doors with two companions, their boots heavy on the floorboards. Clayton's grin carried across the room even before his voice did. "Well now, if it ain't Turner." The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting. Clayton leaned an elbow on the bar, eyes sweeping the room before settling on Elias. "Heard you been keepin' a wild one up at your place." His tone dripped with mockery. Elias didn't move, didn't blink. He lifted his cup, sipped slow, then set it down with deliberate calm. "You got something to say, Reeves? Say it plain." Clayton pushed off the bar, swaggering closer. "She's Apache, ain't she? Folks talk. You think you can hide her out, play house while the rest of us live by the rules?" His voice had risen just enough to catch the attention of the card players at the next table. Silence edged the laughter now, unease coiling in the smoky air. Elias stood slowly, his chair scraping back against the wood. His voice was steady, flat as iron. "You come near my land again, you won't walk away." The words fell heavy, and for a moment no one moved. Clayton's grin faltered, but pride forced him to hold it. He spat near the stove, his boots scuffing hard against the floor. "Careful, Turner. She ain't worth what you're buyin'." The barkeep cleared his throat nervously. "Boys, take it outside, or take it somewhere else." Elias didn't break his stare. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him. Clayton hesitated, then jerked his head toward his companions. They turned, pushing through the swinging doors with a slam that echoed long after their boots hit the street. Elias remained standing, his jaw tight, his heart steady in the wake of the storm. Around him, talk resumed in careful murmurs, but eyes followed him as he walked out. On the far end of Main Street, the church bell rang noon. Its sound cut clear through the noise of the saloon behind him, a reminder of a higher law than the one Clayton Reeves had tried to wield. Elias touched the brim of his hat as he passed, a silent acknowledgement, then mounted his horse. He had drawn his line, and the town knew it. By the time Elias rode back from town, the sun was slipping behind the ridge, painting the land in copper light. Smoke rose thin from the cabin chimney, and the sight steadied him more than he expected. Ahyoka was outside, crouched by the small patch of earth near the porch, turning soil with a stick as though willing it into a garden. She stood quickly when she saw him, her eyes searching his face. "You saw them?" "I saw them," Elias said, sliding from the saddle. "Clayton and the others. They won't stop easy, but they know I'm watching." Her shoulders eased just slightly, though the set of her jaw remained hard. She followed him inside without another word. That evening, they shared a meal of beans and bread, simple fare but filling. Ahyoka sat across the table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered. When the silence stretched too long, she rose, crossed the room, and knelt by the small chest where Elias kept his few belongings. From within the coat she had worn since the creek, she drew out a small leather pouch. She held it for a moment before speaking. "My mother's," she said softly. Then she opened it and drew out a necklace of beads, worn smooth with age, strung in patterns that caught the firelight. Elias's breath caught. It was not just ornament, it was memory, heritage, a fragment of a people scattered and scarred. Ahyoka held it out, her hands trembling only once before she steadied them. "She say, when I find place safe, I keep this there, not before." Elias hesitated, then reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took the necklace. He didn't put it on, didn't pocket it. He set it gently on the shelf above the fire, beside the old Bible that had been his own wife's keepsake. Two worlds resting side by side, different, yet bound now by circumstance. When he turned back, Ahyoka was watching him, her dark eyes softer than he had yet seen them. "You trust me?" she said, not as question but as fact. "I do," Elias answered. His voice came rough, but it carried truth. Later, they worked side by side, mending a stretch of fence. The horse grazed nearby, the wind carrying the smell of dry grass across the mesa. Ahyoka handed him tools before he asked, her steps sure despite the rough ground. At one point, the wire slipped and nicked Elias's hand. Before he could brush it off, she caught his wrist, her fingers gentle as she wrapped a strip of cloth around the cut. He looked at her then, the heat of the sun on his shoulders, the cool steadiness of her touch grounding him. Something unspoken tightened between them, stronger than fear, deeper than gratitude. That night, as the fire burned low, Elias sat sharpening his knife while Ahyoka mended one of his shirts. The rhythm of her needle matched the rasp of his blade, a quiet harmony filling the cabin. When she finished, she folded the shirt neatly and set it in front of him. "My mother teach me," she said. Elias nodded, his throat tight. "She taught you well." For a long moment they sat in silence, the firelight flickering across their faces. Then Ahyoka reached for the coat, pulled it around her shoulders, and looked toward him. Not with suspicion this time, but with the steady, cautious trust of someone who had chosen to stay. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of dust and the far-off sound of coyotes. Inside, the cabin felt less like a refuge against fear and more like the beginning of something worth guarding with his life. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The night came on heavy, without wind, the air thick enough to muffle sound. Elias stood on the porch, lantern dark, eyes scanning the tree line. The horses in the corral shifted restlessly, ears pricked, hooves scuffing the dirt. He had learned long ago to trust animals. They sensed what men tried to hide. Inside, the cabin fire burned low. Ahyoka sat near the hearth, her back straight, the rifle across her knees. She looked small wrapped in the coat, but her eyes were sharp, following every creak of timber, every snap of ember. Elias stepped back into the doorway. "Something's out there," he said, voice low. She nodded once, already knowing. The two of them moved in silence, each action measured. Elias checked the rifle by touch, sliding the chamber open, the faint click loud in the stillness. Ahyoka shifted closer to the wall, crouched low, the firelight flickering against her face. Minutes stretched like hours. The night outside pressed close, filled with nothing but the sound of insects and the occasional call of an owl. Yet Elias's skin prickled, the old instinct of a scout that told him he was being watched. Then it came, the crunch of a boot in dry grass. Slow, deliberate, circling the corral. Elias stiffened, his hand tightening on the rifle. Another step followed, then the faint rattle of wood at the fence line. Someone was testing the latch. Ahyoka's breath quickened, but her hands remained steady on the rifle. She looked to Elias, her eyes wide but unflinching. "They're here," she whispered. Ahyoka nodded once, signaling for silence. He eased the door bar into place, then crouched beside her. Through the shutters, a shadow moved. 2 figures, low against the ground. A third lingered further back, watching. Clayton, no doubt. The urge to storm outside pulsed hot in Elias's chest, but he held back. Timing mattered. He would not waste strength until the moment called. Instead, he leaned close to Ahyoka, his voice barely a breath. "Stay low. If they push the door, you fire. Don't wait for me." Her dark eyes met his. "I will." He studied her face then, the tight set of her jaw, the scar of fear turned into resolve. She was no longer the trembling girl from the creek. Something had shifted. She had chosen to stand. Outside, laughter rang faint and cruel, drifting through the night like smoke. The sound made Elias's teeth clench, but he steadied himself, whispering into the silence, a prayer as old as his faith. "Lord, keep us in your watch. Let no shadow break us." The laughter faded, replaced by hushed voices and the shuffle of boots moving back into the dark. They weren't attacking yet, only prowling, reminding him they could. Testing the edges of his resolve. Elias stayed at the door until the sounds vanished completely. Then he eased down onto the floor beside Ahyoka. Neither spoke. The fire cracked low, casting long shadows across the walls. The night stretched on, heavy with waiting. This was no longer a question of if they would come, only when. By dawn, Elias knew they would return. The night had been a test, nothing more. He saddled the horse early, rode the fence line, and found tracks fresh in the dirt. 3 sets of boots, circling close, then pulling away toward the ridge. They had been bold enough to come within spitting distance of his land. Bold men never stopped at circling. When the sun dipped again, Elias kept the rifle laid across his knees as he sat on the porch. The sky bled orange, shadows long across the yard. Ahyoka hovered by the doorway, silent but alert. The sound of hooves came just as the last light bled away. 3 riders, dust rising behind them, slowed near the corral. Elias stood, every muscle hardening. The lead rider swung down, Clayton Reeves. His smirk carried across the distance like a slap. "Evenin', Merrick," Clayton called. "Heard you've got company." Elias didn't move from the porch. "You're trespassing." Clayton spread his hands wide, all mock courtesy. "Just paying a visit, neighborly." The other 2 shifted in their saddles, eyes darting between Elias and the cabin. One spat in the dirt. The unspoken threat hung thicker than the dust. Elias stepped down into the yard, rifle loose but ready. "This is your one warning. Turn around." Clayton chuckled, but his eyes held that sharp, mean glint Elias remembered from town. You think you can keep her? She ain't yours. She don't belong here. Before Elias could answer, the cabin door creaked. Ahyoka stepped out, the firelight behind her casting her frame in shadow. Her hands were tight at her sides, but her voice carried clear across the yard. I will not run again. The words landed heavier than any bullet. Clayton's smirk faltered, just for a moment. He barked a laugh to cover it. Girl, you don't know what you're saying. I know, Ahyoka said, steady as iron. You took my clothes, my food. You laughed. No more. Elias felt something surge in his chest, not anger this time, but pride. She was no longer standing behind him. She was standing with him. Clayton shifted closer, his boots crunching the dirt. Elias raised the rifle just enough for the message to be clear. Another step, and you won't take another breath. The yard went still. Even the horses seemed to hold. The other two riders exchanged uneasy looks, one muttering, "Clay, let's go." Clayton stared long at Elias, then at Ahyoka, his jaw tight. Spite burned in his eyes, but so did caution. At last, he spat hard into the dirt. This ain't over. Elias didn't blink. It is if you ride away. The gang mounted and turned, dust rising behind them as they retreated into the fading light. Only when the sound of hooves vanished did Elias lower the rifle. He turned to Ahyoka. She still stood in the doorway, chin high, her breathing fast but her gaze steady. For the first time, she had spoken not as a fugitive, but as someone who had claimed her ground. The storm rolled in at dusk, low thunder shaking the hills before the first drops fell. By nightfall, rain poured steady against the roof, a sound like endless drumming that filled every silence. Elias checked the shutters twice, made sure the latch on the door was tight. He wasn't worried about men tonight. No fool would linger long in a storm this heavy. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight, the flames throwing soft gold across rough-hewn walls. Ahyoka sat on the cot, her hair unbound, dark strands falling loose as she combed them with her fingers. She looked smaller somehow, softened by the storm's hush. Elias set a pot of beans near the fire, the smell of smoke and simmering broth mixing with the damp air. He sat across from her, knife in hand, whittling at a block of wood more to steady his hands than to shape anything useful. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the storm did, beating against the shutters, filling the space between breaths. At last, Ahyoka broke the silence. "You fought them," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Elias glanced up. Her eyes caught the firelight, reflecting something deeper than fear. "I wasn't letting them take another thing from you," he answered. Her gaze held his, sharp at first, then softening. "You could have sent me away, safer for you." Elias shook his head slowly. "I don't leave folks to fend for themselves, not then, not now." The fire popped, sparks leaping. Ahyoka lowered her eyes, her fingers brushing the rope burn at her shoulder, the faint scar that lingered. She hesitated, then whispered, "I don't want to be afraid every night." Elias set down the knife. The storm hammered harder, but his voice cut clear through it. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." She looked up, puzzled, until he added softly, "Book of Matthew. My wife, she leaned on that verse in hard times." His throat tightened, but he pressed on. "It's true, Ahyoka. Fear don't get the last word." Something shifted in her face then, as if the words laid down a bridge she could step onto. Slowly, she moved from the cot to the hearth, sitting closer to the fire, and closer to him. They ate together in silence, sharing the pot between them, steam rising in the warm glow. When she finished, Ahyoka set the bowl aside and drew her blanket tight. Then, after a long pause, she laid her head against his shoulder. Elias stilled, the weight of her small frame both fragile and anchoring. He didn't move to pull her closer, not yet. But when she sighed, a slow breath that seemed to release days of fear, he let his arm rest gently around her. The storm raged outside, rain striking the earth in torrents, but inside the cabin there was calm. Not the fragile calm of hiding, but something steadier. A shelter made not of wood and stone, but of trust beginning to take root. The storm broke by morning, leaving the land washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. For a day, it seemed as though the rain had driven the trouble off. Elias repaired fence posts, Ahyoka swept out the cabin, and a thin peace settled over the place. But peace never held long. By the second night, hooves pounded the ridge again, 3 riders, bold and unhurried. Elias heard them before he saw them, their laughter rolling down through the dark like thunder that hadn't quite left. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The moon was high, lighting the yard clear as day. Clayton Reeves sat tall in the saddle, his hat pushed back, that smirk carved deep across his face. His men flanked him, restless, itching for trouble. "Well now," Clayton drawled, "look at this. Cabin all cozy, smoke in the chimney. Almost like you're settling down with her, Merrick." Elias said nothing. He let the silence speak. His rifle held loose but steady, the barrel glinting in the moonlight. Clayton leaned forward on his reins. "You think you can keep her, an Apache girl? Town won't stand for it." "Best hand her over before this turns ugly." Elias's jaw tightened. "You set one boot inside my fence, you won't walk out again." The words came flat, cold as iron, not shouted, not barked, simply stated as truth. The younger rider on Clayton's left shifted uneasily. "Clay, he means it." But Clayton cut him off with a sneer. "You think one man and a scared girl can hold against us?" The cabin door creaked. Ahyoka stepped into the frame, rifle clutched to her chest. Her voice carried, clear and sharp. "Not scared, not running, not again." Clayton's smirk twitched, faltering for the briefest second. He spat into the dirt. Fine words for someone who don't belong. Elias stepped down from the porch, closing the distance to the fence. His eyes locked on Clayton's. "She belongs where she chooses, and she's chosen here. You want to test that? Come ahead. But you'd better be ready to bury friends before the night's out." The words landed heavy. Even the horses pawed uneasily at the dirt. For a moment, it seemed Clayton might draw. His hand hovered near his revolver, his breath sharp in the cool night. But something in Elias's stance, steady, unshaking, every inch the man who had walked battlefields and buried too many, gave him pause. Clayton's grin returned, thinner now, meaner. "This ain't done," he hissed. "You'll see." He jerked his reins, wheeling his horse around. His men followed, though not without a glance back at Elias, eyes wary, as if they'd glimpsed something harder than stone. Elias didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hooves faded into the night. When he finally turned, Ahyoka was still in the doorway, her shoulders square, her rifle tight in her hands. "You drew the line," she said softly. Elias nodded, his voice gravel. "And they know it now." But in his chest, he also knew. A line drawn was a line tested. And Clayton wasn't finished testing. The following days were restless ones. Elias kept close to the cabin, rifle never far from reach. Ahyoka worked beside him, carrying water, sweeping the porch, even patching his shirts with steady hands. Yet her eyes often strayed toward the horizon, watching for riders. The silence between them was not fear anymore, but waiting for the storm of men that would come. It came near sundown. 3 riders again, dust rising behind them. Clayton Reeves led the way, his grin wide, his eyes hard. He pulled up at the edge of the yard, swung down from his saddle, and paced forward with the swagger of a man too used to taking what he wanted. His 2 companions lingered close behind, spittin', mutterin', glancin' toward the cabin. Elias stepped down from the porch, rifle in hand but angled low. His body was taut, every nerve sharp. Clayton's voice rang out across the yard. "I told you before, Merrick, she don't belong here. Apache filth has no place in these hills. Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you be." Elias said nothing. His silence was a wall. The cabin door opened. Ahyoka stepped out, her hair braided, her mended dress clean, her chin high. The firelight inside cast her silhouette tall against the night. She did not hover behind Elias this time. She moved to stand beside him. "I belong where I choose," she said, her voice steady as steel. Clayton froze, his grin crackin'. "You don't know what you're saying, girl." Her eyes locked on his. "I know. You took my clothes, my food. You laughed. You tried to make me nothing. But I will not run. I stay here." The words cut through the air sharper than any blade. Clayton's jaw worked, fury flashing in his eyes. His men shifted uncomfortably, one muttering under his breath. The power had shifted, and they felt it. Elias's voice broke the silence, low and final. "You heard her. She stays. And if you think otherwise, you'll answer to me." Clayton spat in the dirt, rage burning in his glare. "This ain't over, Merrick. Not by a long shot." Elias raised the rifle, his stance unyielding. "Then make your move now, or ride." The tension stretched tight as wire, the kind that could snap with a single twitch of a trigger. At last, Clayton's courage faltered. He swung into the saddle, fury twisting his face. His companions followed, relief plain in their retreat. As their hoofbeats faded, Elias lowered the rifle. He turned to Ahyoka, but she was already watching him, her dark eyes fierce, her shoulders squared. For the first time, her voice carried no tremor. "This is my place now," she said. Elias's chest tightened. In her words, he heard not just defiance, but belonging. She was no longer a shadow seeking refuge. She was a woman choosing her ground, and choosing him. The night after Clayton's retreat was restless for Elias. He sat long at the table, rifle laid across his knees, eyes shifting to the door at every gust of wind. Old habits kept him sharp, but the weight in his chest was no longer only about danger. It was about what he stood to lose. By the hearth, Ahyoka tended the fire, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. She moved quietly, each gesture sure, not the frightened girl he had lifted from the creek days ago. When she turned, her eyes found him, steady and searching. "You would have fought them all," she said softly. Elias's jaw tightened. "If it came to it." Her gaze lingered, as though she could see through the gruff answer to the ache beneath. Then, slowly, she crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, her hand brushing against the rough fabric of his sleeve. "You already have fought," she whispered, "for me." He met her eyes then, and for a long breath the room was silent save for the crackle of the fire. Elias set the rifle aside and stood, the distance between them gone in a step. "I don't want you afraid here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not of them, not of me. This place, it's yours now, as much as mine." For a moment, she only looked at him. Then she reached for his hand, lifting it to her shoulder where the rope burn had once marked her skin. The scar was fading, but the memory of it still lived. "You make it safe," she said. "Not just the cabin, you." The words struck deep, more than any declaration of loyalty or thanks. Elias felt something loosen in him, something he had kept bound since the day he buried his wife. For the first time in years, he let it go. He bent his head, and when his lips found hers, it was not hurried or fierce, but steady, sure, the kind of kiss that sealed a vow without words. Ahyoka leaned into him, her hands clutching his back as if anchoring herself to the ground she had claimed. When at last they parted, the fire had burned low, filling the cabin with a soft, shifting glow. Elias brushed a strand of hair from her face, his rough fingers gentle. She did not flinch, only rested her forehead against his chest, her breathing calm. They lay down together on the cot that night, no longer separated by distance or fear. His arm draped over her waist, her hand resting lightly over his. Outside, the coyotes howled and the wind rustled the trees, but inside there was stillness. Not fragile stillness, but the kind born of choice and resolve. For the first time since the war, since the fever, since the endless years of silence, Elias Merrick let himself believe in something beyond survival. In the rhythm of her breathing beside him, he found it. Home. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. The morning broke clear. The sky washed pale after nights of storm and strife. Elias saddled the horse in silence, his hands steady but his thoughts turning. He had drawn his line against Clayton Reeves, and for now it held. Yet he knew silence was no shield in the long run. The town would whisper, men would stir, and sooner or later the law would be forced to take its place in the matter. Ahyoka stepped onto the porch, her braid neat, her dress mended, her chin lifted. She carried herself differently now, not as a guest uncertain of her welcome, but as a woman who had chosen her ground. "You go?" she asked, her voice calm. Elias looked up from the cinch strap, met her eyes. "Into town," he said. "Best we end this before it begins again." She held his gaze a long moment before nodding. "I come." They rode slow along the muddy road, the horse picking its way through ruts carved by storm water. Ahyoka's hands rested firm against Elias's back, not clinging as before, but steady, balanced. The hills gave way to the flat stretch of town, where smoke curled from chimneys and wagons rattled down the main street. As they entered, conversation faltered. Heads turned. Some faces held curiosity, others disapproval, a few outright scorn. An Apache woman riding in with Elias Merrick was not a sight easily ignored. Elias kept his eyes ahead, jaw set. He had walked into towns full of judgment before. This time, he wasn't walking alone. He tied the horse in front of the sheriff's office and helped Ahyoka down. She squared her shoulders, her hand brushing the bead necklace that now hung openly at her throat, a piece of her past, visible to all. Together, they stepped inside. Sheriff Ward, a man weathered by years and lines of wear around his eyes, looked up from his desk. His gaze shifted from Elias to Ahyoka, lingering, not unkind, but weighted. "Merrick," he said slowly, "heard some talk." "You heard right," Elias said. "Clayton Reeves and 2 others came to my land, trespassed, threatened her, tried to spook my stock." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "Clayton's been trouble before, but this—" His eyes settled on Ahyoka. "Miss, you want to tell me yourself?" Ahyoka stepped forward, her voice steady though her hands were tight at her sides. "3 men. They stop me near town. They take my food, my clothes. They laugh. Then they come at night to Merrick's cabin." The sheriff studied her a moment, then nodded. "And you want charges brought?" Her dark eyes hardened. "I want them stay away. I want no man take again." The words hung in the air like iron. Sheriff Ward exhaled, slow. "Reckon that's fair. I'll ride out, speak to his old man, make it plain. If Clayton sets foot near your place again, there'll be more than talk waiting." Elias's jaw tightened. "Talk won't hold men like him, Sheriff, not forever." Ward met his gaze, tired but firm. "Then make sure you're in the right if steel ever gets drawn." "My job's to see the law on your side. Don't give 'em reason to claim otherwise." Elias gave a short nod. He had heard worse advice. When they stepped back into the street, the eyes of the town followed them still. A man near the saloon muttered something low. Another spat in the dust. But Ahyoka did not lower her head. She walked beside Elias, her steps firm, her shoulders squared. For every whisper, she carried herself taller. Back at the horse, Elias helped her mount. She glanced once down the street, at the faces turned their way, then back at him. "They stare," she said softly. "Let them," Elias answered. "Doesn't change a thing." As they rode out, the weight of the stairs faded with each step. Beyond the town, the hills rose again, wide and open, the sky stretching vast and endless. Elias looked ahead, but his thoughts turned inward. He felt the verse stir in his chest, quiet but steady. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The words carried him, not as a soldier, not as a rancher, but as a man who had found something worth guarding, someone worth walking beside. The ride back from town was slower, the air cool, the sky a pale stretch of blue with clouds drifting high. Elias kept one hand light on the reins, the other resting near Ahyoka's knee as she rode behind him. Her presence was no longer fragile, no longer that of someone clinging. She rode steady, as though she had always belonged there. When they reached the cabin, smoke from the chimney welcomed them, the familiar shape of the land settling into Elias's chest like a steady heartbeat. He helped her down, and together they carried the small bundle of supplies from the saddle to the porch. Flour, coffee, seed. It was the seed Ahyoka held most carefully. She turned the small packet in her hands, her dark eyes reflecting the weight of it. Life waiting to be planted. "We make a garden," she said softly. Elias nodded. Time to put roots in. The next morning, they walked out together to the small patch of earth she had been tending. The soil was dark, still damp from the storm. Elias turned it with the spade, his shoulders working steady. Ahyoka knelt beside him, pressing the seeds into the earth one by one, her fingers careful, reverent. Birdsong carried through the air, the sky wide and bright above them. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension pulling at Elias's shoulders, no glance toward the ridge for riders. Only the rhythm of work, the quiet promise of growth. When the last row was covered, Ahyoka sat back on her heels, dirt on her hands, a small smile tugging at her lips. Elias stood over her, the sun warm on his face, and felt something swell in his chest, a peace he had thought long lost. "You've made this place different," he said, his voice rough. She looked up at him, her braid falling loose against her shoulder. "We make it," she corrected gently, "together." The words settled deep. Together. Not guest and host, not protector and burden, but partners. They walked back to the cabin, their steps slow, unhurried. Inside, Elias lit the fire while Ahyoka set the pot for stew. The space no longer felt hollow or cold. Her bead necklace rested beside his wife's old Bible on the shelf above the hearth. 2 lives, 2 histories, sharing the same place. As the stew simmered, Ahyoka braided her hair with the small comb Elias had bought for her. When she finished, she turned to him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "You gave me this. You fixed my dress. You fought for me. Why?" Elias set down the strap he had been mending and met her gaze. The words came slow, steady. "Because I want you here. Not because you needed a place, because you chose it." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she knelt in front of him, took his hand in hers, and pressed it to her chest. "I choose," she said softly. "I stay." Elias felt his throat tighten, but he nodded, his hand steady against the beat of her heart. "Then we make this home, for good." That evening, they sat together on the porch, the horizon burning gold as the sun slipped behind the ridge. The air was still, the land quiet. Ahyoka leaned against him, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. "They will not come back," she murmured. Elias's gaze stayed on the hills, steady. "And if they do, they'll find we're ready." The words were not born of fear, but of certainty. For a while, they sat in silence, the crickets rising in chorus, the last light fading into stars. Elias thought of all the nights past, the girl in the creek, the fear in her eyes, the shadows outside the cabin. All of it had led to this moment. When they finally rose to go inside, Elias didn't bother with the bedroll on the floor. He lay beside her on the cot, the firelight soft across the walls, her breathing calm against his chest. For the first time in years, he did not listen for footsteps in the night. He listened only to the sound of life beside him. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the hills and shone across the patch of newly planted earth, Elias Merrick smiled, a rare, unguarded smile. It was no longer just a cabin, it was home. Out on the frontier, life was never easy. It was marked by loss, loneliness, and nights when the only shield was courage and the quiet strength of faith. Yet, as Elias and Ahyoka found, even in the harshest lands, love and trust could grow like seeds in the soil. Their story is more than a tale of danger and survival. It is a reminder of the silent heroes of the past. Men and women who carried scars but still chose hope, who built homes out of cabins and families out of chance encounters. Perhaps it stirs in you memories of your own journey, moments when compassion, resilience, or faith carried you through. That is the heart of the true Wild West stories, not just gunfights or dust, but the triumph of the human spirit. If this story touched you, please like, share, and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too.